So, welcome back to the Under Pressure podcast. I'm Dr. Jonathan Sakia, and I'm honored to be your host. Before introducing today's guest, it's important to note that this podcast is supported by Myo1, a Canadian medical device manufacturer. Please refer to the show notes for additional information. If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, you can contact us at underpressure@nextsense.com. That's underpressure, one word, at nxtscns.com. We'll put the address in the show notes also. So today I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Samir Mehta, an orthopedic trauma surgeon, professor, and chief of orthopedic trauma service at the University of Pennsylvania. Just before we got on, I was telling him that where I live, the local church has the birth records of William Penn in their archives. So the good doctor's built a career not only around managing complex injuries, but also around advancing how surgeons are trained, how technology is integrated into care, and how medicine continues to evolve towards more personalized and predictive approaches. His work spans trauma surgery, resident education, product development, global service initiatives, and emerging efforts focused on accurately predicting fracture healing. And we're going to cover all of that. Today's conversation explores what expertise really means in orthopedic surgery. That has me intrigued. How judgment develops under pressure, and how innovation can improve care without losing sight of the patient experience. So, Dr. Samir Mehta, welcome to Under Pressure.
Thank you for having me. I'm really glad to be here, and it's a true pleasure to chat with you.
And I have to say thank you because it's very early in the morning where you are. So good on you. It's much appreciated.
Well, if it makes you feel better, our day typically starts here. My residents will start rounding at around 5:15 in the morning. So this is we're in the midst of the morning usually by now. So
Right.
yeah.
So, Samir, your career spans trauma, surgery, education, as I said, innovation, and global outreach. Looking back, what experiences most shaped the way that you think about orthopedic trauma today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when you look back at orthopedic trauma, I would argue that orthopedic trauma used to be a recreational sport. What I mean by that is everybody did it. Every orthopedic surgeon, in some countries that are less resourced, the general surgeons were your orthopedic traumatologists. But because orthopedic trauma is so common, everybody had to roll up their sleeves and do it. As we know, if you look at the data, motorbike accidents are the number one cause of death and disability in men between the age of 18 and 45 worldwide, right? More than cancer, more than heart disease. This is what is impacting the, in many countries, the people who are supporting their families, supporting themselves, etc. Um, orthopedic trauma is extremely common, and I think the when we talk about orthopedic trauma, it's not just when people think of that, they think of the individual who gets hit by a car or is in a bad car accident or falls off a building or some you know uh, high energy huge sort of event. But when we talk about orthopedic trauma, we also talk about fracture care, right? You break your ankle playing rugby or soccer, as we like to say in the States, right? You break your clavicle falling off your bike. That's also orthopedic trauma. And so there's a spectrum. So everybody would participate. And so I think the most formative experience for me was going to a fellowship in orthopedic traumatology in Seattle at Harborview, which is affiliated with the University of Washington. And that really opened my eyes to the fact that there is a layer of expertise, a layer of higher level thinking when it comes to fracture care, when it comes to orthopedic trauma, that is different than, say, going out there and just kind of doing it because I'm on call or doing it because it showed up in my hospital. And then I think after that, there were experiences that layered upon that. I was able to do a second fellowship at the University of Saarland in Hamburg, Germany, also showing me how the European system worked. A North American traveling fellowship that allowed me to go, city by city along the eastern seaboard of North America, seeing how different trauma centers ran their shop. And you start to realize that, there are lots of these places where the fracture care, the trauma care that's being provided is being provided by people who are dedicated to that role, dedicated to that position. And so I think the most formative piece of it was just being exposed to this concept that orthopedic trauma, orthopedic fracture care is not a recreational sport.
Yeah, I think back to to my early training, Samir, and yeah, you're absolutely right. Both in Britain and even when I moved to America, a lot of trauma was managed by general surgeons, and
Right.
it,
The house officer that happens to be
yeah,
in house at at the NHS hospital.
yeah, and of course things have now changed dramatically this side of the duck pond, as they should, because the quality
Right.
of care is obviously so much better. When I look back on my career, the service or mission work that I was involved with are some of the most enduring and rich memories and led to friendships that have lasted the test of time. And I always say to people that whenever I gave my time to do a service mission to teach overseas, I always learned much more than I taught, and not just about medical care, but about life, the universe, and everything, to quote Douglas Adams. Tell us one or two of your recollections and why you would encourage orthopedic surgeons who haven't done this to consider taking the plunge.
Oh, so I think the most meaningful experience or the most career changing experience for me when it came to service work was the 2 weeks I spent in Haiti after the 2010 earthquake. So I went to Haiti about 12 days after the initial earthquake, through a partnership between our institution and Partners in Health, which is out of the Boston area. And we sent a team down from the institution, myself, a general surgeon. I took one of my senior residents. We had critical care nursing, we had anesthesia. It was a dramatic experience for a variety of reasons. Um, you start to combine a uh, the geopolitical climate in that country plus a an event like an earthquake plus the existing infrastructure, and it really creates the perfect storm. It wasn't my first service mission. I did my first service experience as a resident in 2005, but it was the one that really it wasn't was it, what opened the door then for me to then do more and more. And I think to your point, there are several reasons to do it. Um, I think that the most important thing is to recognize that you're a guest, that you're a visitor, that you are there as a resource. You cannot be a drain on the existing healthcare ecosystem. Um, you also have to recognize that you are not there. And I've heard this from people. By your presence, are you undermining the relationship between the existing physicians and their patient population? Are you there to provide a service, i.e., operate? Are you there to educate? You know that whole saying, "Show a man to teach him, give a man a fish, eats for a day. Show a man a fish, etc." Um, uh, you know, one of the most distressing things I've heard is that I've heard some people say, "Well, I don't feel ready to be a surgeon, so I'm going to go and I'm going to use the word that I heard from somebody. I'm going to go ahead and take 6 months and do some work abroad where I can practice my skills." And I almost wanted to vomit in my mouth, right? Like it took me by such surprise that that there are individuals who look at the service piece like that. I think when I think about service, I think you have to provide not just good care, but great care. You really can't have complications, because if you're going to be doing surgery that is not typical for that region, if there is a complication, who's going to manage it? If you're using hardware that is um, not typical for that region, who's going to have a screwdriver to take it out? You do some complex joint replacement or some complex spine procedure. What happens if? What happens when? And so I think these things are really critical to think about as you start to go down that road of mission work. What is your goal, right? Is your goal again to go down and do 15 surgeries in a week? Okay, there's value to that, right? Because those surgeries may not happen if you're not there. But what happens when you leave? What's the infrastructure of the organization that you're working with? Is it a one and done phenomena? Will there be other teams that follow you? Are you going to go back to the same region over and over so you can provide some continuity of care? How is it going to be more than just a flash in the pan, if you will?
Yeah, there have been many discussions, guidelines about itinerant surgery, and if you're going somewhere, you need to think those things through. Absolutely, and I concur. Um, but I hinted at the fact that the missions I've done, I've gone back to the same place again and again,
Yep.
and I will never forget. I was very privileged to be with the first group to go to China to teach laparoscopic surgery. When
Yep.
we went back a year later, it blew me away how competent these people were. The numbers that they had accrued and the techniques that they had developed and were doing with precious few resources. And like I say, taught a lot. I'd encourage anyone out there, do it. Changes the way you view the world and makes you a lot more of a grateful human being.
I cannot agree with you more. I think re-entry, I call it re-entry because I've done it so much. That first week, 2 weeks back, it is hard to come back to the States when you're abroad for a week doing this kind of work. When you go to these countries and you see that, they're making a wheelchair out of bicycle wheels and a lawn chair, and then you come back to your clinic or your office and someone's issue is around, their elbow hurting during their golf game. And, I don't want to minimize that person's issues, but the world is a really big place. And I've made it a point to try and take two senior residents with me on every service trip I do.
Good for you.
Um,
Good for you.
Two residents who are accomplished because again, it's not practice, but also ones that will pay it forward, right?
Yeah,
That listen, I'm happy to support your education, your service, but hopefully when you're 5, 10, 15 years into your career, you're then paying it forward and doing the same thing. And if we can just build that out, um, I think it becomes a very unique opportunity. And to your point, there's a lot of very smart people, very capable people across the globe. And if they
yeah,
had even like in your case, like you said, a small amount of education, small amount of resources, they have the ingenuity to really then expand that and think about the multiplicative effect of that engagement.
very much so. So, Samir, you've chaired and led multiple cases that taught me the most and surgical controversy discussions over the years. Are there specific complications or mistakes that fundamentally changed the way you practice? Maybe give us an example or two that stick in your mind.
I've always said that the most learning happens from those cases that push you to your brink, to where you you uh, there's been an error, uh, a, a surgical change of plan intraoperatively. There was something unanticipated because it was unique, or maybe wasn't something that you were looking for, and you've had to think on your feet. It is an extremely lonely feeling when you're in the operating room and uh, it's just you, right? Your learner, your resident can't help you. The staff can't help you. There's nobody in the hallways that does what you do that can run in and give you a set of hands. It is a very, very lonely feeling. And I think every resident, every surgical surgeon in training, every surgeon at some point, if they don't feel it, they need to feel it. They need to learn how that feels to manage that. And I've had a few of those types of cases, right? Cases where, you know, I remember a young man, it was early in my career. I wasn't on call. He was driving home from the airport, and he had three kids at home. He worked at the airport baggage handler. He was routinely driving home. It was probably 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And a gentleman had rented a sports car for his 50th birthday. And he and his friend were sort of opening it up on a long stretch of a road near the airport. And this gentleman was coming home. They were driving this sports car at about 120 miles an hour, and they lost control and they hit him. The two gentlemen in the sports car died on impact, but this gentleman was brought to our hospital in extremis. Huge human being, physically large, open pelvic fracture, open femur, open tibia, open forearm.
Oh,
Um, I wasn't on call, but the person on call was as we talked about earlier, somebody who doesn't do orthopedic trauma, but he does basic stuff. He can put a rod in a femur, he can put an X-fix on. But when you start to get into these polytrauma, high energy, so the residents called me. I had to, you know, essentially stop everything that was going on at that time, which I wasn't anticipating, as you could imagine. But I happened to be in town. Got in my car, went to the hospital. Patient was too sick to go to the operating room. They were trying to die. We had to do the case in interventional radiology. We had to take patient back to the trauma bay, then up to the OR. It was we didn't have a unique tool that some hospitals have. For a unique tool that is, I wouldn't say it's common. It wasn't something we anticipated we would need, but and his outcome wouldn't have changed. He 3 days later ended up getting DIC, disseminated intravascular coagulation, and died. Um, but his case and his name and his story are a stark reminder of how the system really is very important, and having the system set up in a way that you will always have the resources and the tools you need is really important. Um,
very much so.
that's just one example. I tell people that every case, every complication sits with me. It weighs on me. It makes you who you are.
I'll tell you something.
I
I recently had a conversation with a retired British neurosurgeon who's written extensively about this subject. And he's a very accomplished gentleman who's done immense things in his career. And he said, I, I don't remember a single one of my successes. All I can remember are my failures. And I talked to him afterwards and I said, that level of humility and transparency is actually extremely healthy, because arrogance and hubris are deadly diseases for not for surgeons, but for the patients they treat. So thank you for sharing that. I want to change tack a
it,
little
it,
bit.
I like just I like to comment one piece on that. And I think it's interesting that you feel that way. He feels that way. I feel that way. You talk to most surgeons, and they will tell you that the complications are the ones that, as you said, make you the better surgeon, right?
Mm,
So I was sued. I live in Philadelphia. It's a highly medically litigious region of the country. Ultimately, I was dropped from the case, but I was sued, and as part of the lawsuit, they depose you, and they request and require your curriculum vitae. And as you noted, my curriculum vitae is full of these situations where we've called these courses "Bring Your Own Disaster," Master's Fracture Forum, case controversies, bring your, what, complicate, different titles, but they all have the same theme, which is show us your mistakes, right? Show us your errors. And this, they were going through my CV trying to, um, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, to set the scene as you as some,
As
yeah,
an
to
incompetent
impugn your,
doctor. Yeah.
yeah, to impugn your
And
reputation.
and I mean, they just went after.
Yeah,
Tell us about these cases. You're making so many mistakes. You're showing so many, and I had to explain to them why that. Number one, we're not talking about catastrophic, but we're also, this is how we learn in medicine, right? We
yeah,
call it quality improvement conference, or morbidity and mortality, which is the historic name that I'm sure you and I are both more familiar with.
yeah,
This is where the learning happens, right? You
yeah.
talk to any physician, any surgeon, and they will tell you that their favorite conference or their most meaningful conference is morbidity and mortality, right?
Oh,
That's where
100%.
the learning happens, right?
100%.
And it's amazing how the lay field, especially these attorneys, and finally my attorney stepped in and I explained it, and but it was interesting to see the other side's perspective. They don't understand
Yeah, they do. Well,
how
listen,
these things are so critical to us.
I fly aeroplanes, have done for many years, and Atul Gawande did a much better job describing it than I would have done. But in
Yes.
aviation, we have a fault-free system of reporting situations so that we can learn
Right.
and improve aviation safety. I want to
Yeah.
change tack a little bit.
Yeah.
Early in your career, you published work looking at scapular fractures as markers for concomitant injury. In fact, it appeared in the National Trauma Database a few years back. What drew you to that question initially, and how did that work shape the way you think about evaluating trauma patients more broadly? And do certain injuries immediately change your level of concern for what else may be happening physiologically or systemically?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. Um, so again, that publication came out of a experience where we had a patient, otherwise other innocuous upper extremity injuries, who ended up with, for lack of a better word, a dead arm. Um, Ended up having compartment syndrome, a neurologic dysfunction, brachial plexus, and ultimately ended up with a four-quarter amputation. And they said the orthopedic injuries were relatively innocuous. Small clavicle fracture, a really minimal non-operative proximal humerus injury. But what they did have was a scapula fracture. And I wasn't on call the weekend that they came in, but sort of picked up on Monday morning when I came back to work. And it turns out that they had something called scapulothoracic dissociation, which is not a common thing in again, not a common injury that people will get. But it got me. But there was a scapula fracture as part of that, and it got me thinking a little bit about these injuries that are markers or harbingers for bigger events. And if you have enough energy to break your scapula, which is when you think about it, a relatively well protected bone. I mean, if you think about us as four-legged animals, if you believe in the theory of evolution, which I've been told some of my patients don't, but if you believe in the theory of evolution, the scapula was meant to protect us, right? When we're walking on all fours, the scapula is that bone on our back that if something were to attack you or attack us, the scapula would protect your rib cage and your internal organs, at least your upper internal organs. And so it's a pretty stout bone. And so for it to be broken suggests that there is more going on. The energy of the injury is such that you've got to really look. And so that's what really triggered that research project. And to your point, it's not just the scapula, right? When I see a pelvic fracture, that tells me that there's more going on than just the pelvic fracture. What's happened to the liver, the spleen, the internal organs? What else is broken if you broke your scapula or your pelvis? What else is broken if you broke your scapula? What other trauma have you sustained? What other soft tissue injuries? It just raises the bar a little bit. And it again goes back to this idea that even the most innocuous things can sometimes be predictive of bigger complications.
Yeah, and you mentioned compartment syndrome as a sequel of this. Interestingly, just before we went live on air, I'm have a friend over, and he was in Italy, and he had a fall and suffered a proximal humerus, scapular, and clavicle injury, and he actually flew back to England. One of my mates here, who's a trauma surgeon, specializes in that neck of the woods, if you will, and he managed it non-operatively. But he said the one thing we're really looking out for is an early compartment syndrome and monitoring for,
Yeah,
because that can be
absolutely.
disastrous, can't it? It really, really
That's
can.
limb threatening, life threatening.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've worked closely with industry on innovation projects throughout your career, whether through product development, educational initiatives. I'm a huge fan of this sort of collaboration, and it's an area where there are those who are opposed to it, and I think are sanctimonious. And the, to my mind, there's no data to suggest this is anything but a great thing. From your perspective, how should surgeons think about collaborating with industry in a way that genuinely advances patient care?
So that's a great question because, to your point, it's something I wrestle with. Because when you're in the academic circles, there is a little bit of uh, uh, I don't use the word concern, but um, it's looked at differently than if you're getting a NIH grant or a grant from a foundation or something like that. At the end of the day, I look at our colleagues in industry as partners, right? And whatever their motivation may be, and we can talk about that. One of their one of their goals is to improve care, to better care. I believe that. I believe that most companies are finding ways, and you can improve care in a variety of different ways. You can introduce new technology. You can also take existing technology and make it less expensive, right? When we talk about that value equation in healthcare, improve quality or decrease cost. And so, whether you are
Preferably
working on trying to
both.
make it, or preferably both, and whether
Yeah.
you're talking about uh, developing an implant or a device that might be more expensive, but might limit the risk of a complication like a compartment syndrome or
Mhm.
like infection, and maybe you pay a little bit more upfront to not have that affect downstream impact. Great. Or you develop something, maybe you develop a rod or a plate that's a little bit cheaper than what you're already using, but just as good, right? Just as reliable, just as sturdy. Okay, that's great too, right? Um, and I think that industry's motivation again may be different than mine or yours, but if they're winning, or if then I'm winning, right? If they're successful in their endeavor developing a new technology, that means that they may make profit on it and whatnot, but that also means that it's successful, and that means that we're bettering patient care, right? Everybody wins in that scenario, in
By
theory.
definition, if a technology improves patient care, the company will be successful. If it does
That's
not, they will
exactly
not.
right. That's
It's
exactly
not
right.
complicated. I don't believe that
Right.
there's kit out there that's being sold that doesn't make patient care better. If it doesn't,
Right.
it will fail.
And who's going to do that, right? Is who's going to support that? um and that's where I struggle, right? Like, does the NIH really care about the syndesmosis of the ankle? Do they? Like, are they going to give me a $1.5 million grant to figure out how to best fix the syndesmosis? The answer is probably not. Is
No.
NHS going to give you a grant to figure out, um, the optimal screw trajectory of the for the proximal humerus to optimize fixation of proximal humerus fractures? Probably not, right? That's not something they're going to fund and support. Somebody has to, though. That has to happen somewhere.
Mhm.
Somebody has to help sort that out. And so I do think that intelligently partnering with industry in a in an ethical, moral way really does improve it moves the needle. It makes a difference. Years ago, there was a blow up in the U.S. About device companies engaging with surgeons and paying surgeons to be consultants or developing IP. And there was a surgeon from a very large institution in the Midwest who was sort of named in the New York Times as part of this investigation, and he helped develop plates and screws for the spine. And after the story broke in the New York Times, his institution had to, and he'd already disclosed everything to his institution well before the New York Times sort of made an expose of it. But he said within 2 weeks of the story breaking in the New York Times, that was sort of disparaging him from working with industry. His clinic was never more full. People were flying from all over the country to see him. And I sort of looked and I said, "What? How did that happen?" He said, "Well, the rationale was if I'm good enough to build and design these implants, then I must be good enough to put them in." And
I've
it sort of
had
struck me. I was like, "That's a great point."
I had the situation with something I developed. I disclosed it to my institution. I said to my institution, I've disclosed to the manufacturer that I've told you that I do not want the royalties for sales at my institution to go to me. I want them to go to the nursing education fund or whatever else you want to do with it. And the hospital said, well, it's a conflict. I said, so you're telling me I can't use a device that I've developed to improve patient care for my patients? I have no personal financial gain from it. Why would you do it? They said, well, it's appearances. So sometimes the lunatics are running the asylum. And I always think it's kind of like the old quote about a nation gets the leaders it deserves. I think it needs doctors to come out and say, we need to work with industry. We are a team. Let's have an honest and transparent relationship. So, along those lines, tell us about
Agreed.
fracture, or a prognostic blood test aimed at predicting fracture healing outcomes and non-union risk, because you've been involved with that.
Yeah, thanks. That is something that is it's been a work uh, a work of the last decade. So again, a lot of our innovation, a lot of our development happens from the things that we see. I love hearing from residents or fellows who, right out of training, want to get involved with consulting or product development. And I sort of look at them and say, well, what do you know? Right? Like, what have you seen? What of the world have you seen to start to talk about your exploits, if you will, right? Um, but one of the things I started to notice in my office was that some fractures don't heal, right? We know that a certain percentage of fractures will not heal, right? About 10 to 15% of broken bones. Nature, for whatever reason, isn't working, right? If you put two bones in the same zip code, they will try and heal. That's normal, right? No different than if you cut your hand, if you left it alone, it should heal. Um, but what I was seeing was that there were some patients who just weren't, right. And I would look at, some of them were surgical, some of them were not. Um, you know, some of them had risk factors like diabetes or nicotine use abuse, obesity, that we know are risk factors for fracture healing. But others were young, healthy, otherwise no obvious medical conditions that you would think would limit their ability to heal fractures. And it got me thinking a little bit. Why do I see patient X heal and patient Y not heal? Even more so, why do I see patient X who has multiple risk factors and comorbidities for what we think affects fracture healing, and we have patient Y who has none of those things, and that person's not healing, but that first one is? It was it was very confusing to me, and so I talked to one of my colleagues, Dr. Haran, has a PhD oncology training background, and you know, orthopedics has been far behind in this concept of personalized medicine. Other aspects of medicine have jumped in this arena. Oncology is probably the biggest one that comes to mind. Cardiology, right? Can we tailor the treatment to the specific patient and the specific variant of disease the patient has? So one thing led to another, and we said, could we predict who's going to heal or not? And so we went on a fishing expedition. We got a gift from a donor. We started taking peripheral blood in my patients who had healed, my patients who had not healed, and my patients who were what we call delayed healers, that they were trying to heal but weren't making it. And we sent it on what's called an Affymetrix gene chip. So we fill this gene chip. It looks like an ice cube tray. We filled this with their blood. We sent it off for gene analysis. So we were literally on a fishing expedition. Unlike other basic science studies where they look at a specific protein or a specific cytokine or a specific growth factor, we said, I don't know what we're looking for, but we are going to take all these patients that we have, some of whom we know didn't heal and some of whom we did, and we're going to try and do a compare and contrast. And we had a mathematician at the institution who could take all of this data, because remember, we're putting it on a gene chip, so we're getting thousands, millions of data points. And we had a mathematician who then was able to cull all that data down and basically gave us a XYZ plot. And you could see that there were certain microRNA that were clustering in our non-unions and certain ones that clustered in the healed patients. And it was, I mean, if you look at this graph, it is clear as day that the non-unions had this certain cluster of microRNAs, and it was a truly distinct population. And that got us really excited. We're like, wow, this is a couple hundred patients, and we're showing this clear discrepancy, clear difference in their biology, right? Again, evolution, right? These people in this corner here, they're different than the rest of the group that heals. And so we are currently, so we took those microRNAs, and we created some intellectual property around those. So we have intellectual property both in North America and in Europe around these cluster of microRNAs. We are now doing a multi-center study in the U.S. at multiple trauma centers on fractures that are coming into the hospital. These patients are getting blood draws at the time of their injury, and then we're following their outcome. We have banked their blood, and we are analyzing it and trying to predict on that end if they will heal or not. And then in a blinded way, comparing that to what truly happens to them. Do they heal or don't they from the trauma centers they're coming into? We are not participating in the trial, so we've already done our study, so this is a validation study. And then ultimately, when this works, if this works, when this works, the next step would be how to then get this into the hands of surgeons, trauma centers, so that when a patient comes in, you're on your bicycle, you crash, you break your femur, you come into the trauma center, we're able to draw some of your blood like we normally would for everything else. We sent it for analysis. We nail your femur, and then when you come back to the office at 6 weeks and say, am I going to heal my fracture? I could tell you with about 80-85% accuracy if you are. And if you're not going to heal, then I would intervene, right? Maybe I get you a bone stimulator. Maybe I take you back and bone graft you. Maybe if you're not behaving the way you should be by 3 months, maybe I jump in sooner and do something like an exchange nailing. But it would
Yeah.
be information that you could act on
Right.
acutely
News
rather
you,
than
news you can
delayed
use.
treatment.
Yeah, yeah. So as orthopedics becomes increasingly data-driven, Samir, with predictive analytics, AI monitoring technologies, these kind of personalized diagnostics, where is innovation going to meaningfully improve care, and where do you think medicine still risks over? Well, what we don't want to do is overcomplicate, right?
Right.
So,
I
what
think
are your thoughts?
the orthopedic mantra has always been KISS, keep it simple, stupid. I always say, B what was it? What BBMF, bone broke me fix. I sort of,
I
I
like
sort of,
that.
I remind people that historically, at least in North America, in the U.S., the people who went into orthopedics, I'm talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s, and I hear this from my mentors and my senior partners. um, they were the bottom of medical school, right? You didn't go into orthopedics if you were smart. If you were smart, you went into general surgery or you went into internal medicine or
I don't know that
cardiology.
that's
It was
true, but,
it was
but
really the bottom of the class that said, okay, I'm going to do orthopedics. And so that's where the bone broke me fix, BBMF, sort of comes from. Obviously, things have changed. And orthopedics now is probably one of the more competitive subspecialties in the US. Um, I think to your point, we have to keep it patient centric, right? One of the things I sometimes see, whether it's from my own residents or from companies, is, and use the term, and this is not meant to be negative, is this concept of over engineering. Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, right? And I think we can't lose sight of the goal. The goal has to be, an efficient way to address patient injuries. And as we think about, to your point about what the future holds, I don't think the future is necessarily going to be about another plate and screw device or another rod device or another external fixator or something like that. I think that it's important for technology to keep up and the metallurgy and the designs to be meaningful for patients. Um, but I think where the future is going to happen in orthopedics is likely things like the use of AR or VR or MR, depending on which letters you like to use in terms of augmented reality. Can I, instead of taking fluoroscopic imaging, exposing my patient to radiation, exposing my OR to radiation, can I put on a pair of goggles and be able to see the anatomy that I'm working on so that I can put screws in the proper place? The use of, and we're seeing this now, robotics and navigation, the use of biologics, the concept of anti-infective tools, anti-infective coatings, barriers to biofilm formation. I think that's what the future holds, right? 3D printed technologies so you can make patient specific implants. We've been doing more of that lately at our own institution, trying to do more work with limb salvage. Um, that's where I think the future is going to be in orthopedic traumatology, right? I think it's going to be a shift away from 316L stainless steel and titanium and more towards the biologic solutions, the value adds, as I like to say.
What about the evolution of surgical education? There's been a lot
Yeah,
of change in professional society meetings. Obviously, we were impacted by COVID, and things have, I think we've learned from that, frankly. Um, are we going to stay with the? I'm a huge fan of the Socratic method of teaching. Basically, I loved the way that we were educated as young
I do
surgeons.
too.
You know, and I think it's hugely important because there's a lot of stuff you just can't learn from AR and VR. Yeah, you can do these so-called soft skills sessions, but there's nothing like having a caring boss who teaches you stuff about life, the universe, and everything. Mentorship, shared experience. What's the future got? I know you've done a lot
Uh,
in resident education,
yeah,
Samir.
we could easily spend an hour talking just about
Sure.
this.
Well, you've got to give us a pithy summary.
Yes, right. So, you said talked about caring boss. I don't even know if they care as long as they care about my education, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think there's so many things that affect this. The generational differences, which are very real. I mean, people don't want to say that, oh, it's just, you're just being an old person. When I walked up school, well, I walked to school, uphill both ways. Like, yes, there's a little bit of like when I was a resident, when I was a student kind of phraseology that drives me nuts because there are truly generational differences. I believe that now. I've
Yeah.
seen enough to realize that they think and look at the world differently than we do. I think that's having an impact. I think when we were learners, there was more ability to have autonomy, and there's been a transition. And look, I'm not saying it's for a bad reason. Things like patient safety come into play, and just having a somebody who is capable taking care of you. But there is a difference between competency and autonomy, and I think we have changed our approach where we are looking to make competent trainees, competent surgeons. But really, what we need to build is people who have the ability to be autonomous. right? So I can tell you what to do and you can execute that, but can you actually figure out what to do independent of my telling you and then execute the task? And I think that piece of autonomy has really been uh, it's really not um, it's not quite the same as it was when we were learners, when we were residents. And I think I find residents struggling when they go into practice because they've not been given the ability, the opportunity to be autonomous in residency the way we were. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, right? Because there's a great TED talk on good or bad, hard to say. Um, I I am sure that when you were a resident and I was a resident, if you were allowed to do things autonomously or under maybe less guidance, that it may not have had the ideal outcome, but it also helped us be better surgeons today. Um, and so this piece of autonomy is really critical. And how do you provide autonomy without compromising patient care? Right. That's the hard part. And then you get to this concept of expertise. And you can't one of my big things about expertise is that you're not going to be an expert, right? The people who are experts actually don't know everything. I think there's this fallacy that, oh, you're an expert, you must know everything. Absolutely not, right? When I think about clinical expertise, clinical expertise is knowing what you don't know, right? I think that's really important. It's knowing what you don't know. And so when you think about how you approach a patient or how you approach a diagnosis, more often than not, I already know what the diagnosis is before I walk into a patient's room, right? I look at an x-ray or I know where they are in their time frame of their injury, and I know what I'm going to be dealing with. Right? And it's almost like playing the game 20 questions. I think you've got a frozen shoulder. And so I'm going to ask you questions like, can you move your shoulder? And if you say yes, I have no problem moving my shoulder. You might say, if I ask you 20 questions, can you move your shoulder? You might say no. Okay, that's a good answer. Do you have any numbness and tingling? Yes. Well, that's not really a frozen shoulder. And then I go to move them, and I can move them. Well, that's also not a frozen shoulder. So now I'm I'm not getting the answers to the questions that I want the way I should be getting them. So now I'm like, well, you're not answering the way I think you should be, but I thought you had a frozen shoulder. I don't know what you have. I'm going to go back to linear reasoning. I'm now going to go back to more linear sort of let's go through this in much more finer detail because you aren't answering the questions I thought you were the way you were going to, and now I need to do a deeper dive to really understand what's going on. And so when I talk about expertise, it's the ability to flip back and forth between this concept of playing 20 questions, if you will, to going back to very linear reasoning through every step of the patient's scenario or the patient's problem. And you say, well, why don't you just do that for every patient? Because that would be extremely time consuming. It would be extremely mentally taxing, and it would take up many life units. It would also decrease my ability to get through the day. And so a lot of times the ability to be an expert in my mind is to recognize when things aren't what you think they are and then be able to go back to a more traditional way of reasoning through a problem.
I've been thinking about what you were saying as you were saying it, and thinking that the word expert is bandied about ever so loosely. And I remember all the sort of snide, jokey remarks about, everyone's a professor, right? The word literally suggests I profess to know.
Right.
And it used to be that, in Britain, where there are far fewer professors per institution, that a professor was defined as someone who talked about operating in surgery and had a PowerPoint to hand and a frequent flyer account. I think we need to think about it very, very carefully. And I'll go back to what I said earlier: humility, a lack of hubris, a desire for lifelong learning. It's been amazing talking to you, and I just wish we had longer But that's sadly all we've got time for today. So it just remains for me to thank Professor Samir Mehta for joining us today, for sharing your expertise, your experiences, your dedication, and your passion for this subject and the patients you look after. I hope they realize how lucky they are. Thank you, Samir.
Thank you. You're very kind. I wish my mom was here to hear that right now, but hopefully she'll hear this podcast. Um, but
Oh, make sure you
I
guys.
will. I'll make sure she does. Yes. But I very much appreciate your time today, and like I said, there's all of these topics we could talk for hours, and we do. I mean, that last piece on expertise. I mean, it's something that my colleagues, my partners, and even with my residents who are really interested in this area of sort of medical education, we
Mhm.
spend lots of time driving deep. And the reality is, I don't know if we'll ever have an answer, right? These are topics that there may never be an answer. And as time goes on and the generations change, the expectations and the bar may move. It's been great. It's been great talking to you.
So, to our audience, thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to listen and demonstrate a desire to see the best care for your patients. Please share this with your colleagues so that Samir's mum can see it. Post on social media and write to us with comments, questions, or suggestions for other podcasts. Remember, the address is under pressure at nextsense.com, under pressure at nxtsens.com. Thanks also to Maya One for supporting this podcast. And all that remains for me is to say once again, thanks for joining. Please stay safe, stay well, stay curious. Bye for now.